A flight attendant ripped up the airplane ticket of a young black boy simply because she believed he didn't belong there. However, everything changed when she discovered that his father owns the entire airline. Ethan Johnson couldn't stop smiling as he walked through the airport terminal, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder. The past week at the Youth Leadership Conference had been amazing, and he couldn't wait to tell his parents about everything he'd learned. He'd made friends from all over the country, given his first real public speech, and even won an award for his community service project proposal. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates, but Ethan took his time, enjoying the last bit of independence before heading home. He got into the airport extra early, just like his dad had taught him. Better to have time to spare than time to stress, Robert would always say. Ethan smiled, thinking about how proud his father would be of how he'd handled himself this week. He reached his gate with plenty of time to spare and settled into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, pulling out his phone to text his mom that he'd made it. A family with young kids sat across from him, the little ones playing some kind of made-up game that involved a lot of giggling. It reminded him of trips with his own family when he was younger. The gate started to fill up as boarding time approached. Ethan gathered his things and got in line when they called for general boarding. He'd done this dozens of times before. Check-in, show ticket, find seat, easy as that. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way the flight attendant at the counter, Karen Lewis according to her name tag, kept glancing his way with narrowed eyes. When it was finally his turn, Ethan stepped up to the counter with his usual polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said, holding out his ticket and ID. Karen barely looked at his face as she snatched the documents from his hand. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with sharp, angry taps. "There seems to be a problem with your ticket," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his cool. He triple-checked everything before leaving home. "I'm sorry, but what's wrong with it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The passengers behind him started to shuffle impatiently. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "This ticket," she spat out the word like it tasted bad, "is clearly fraudulent." Before Ethan could process what was happening, she gripped the edges of his boarding pass and tore it clean in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo through the terminal. The terminal went quiet, then erupted in whispers. Ethan felt his face burning as dozens of eyes turned to stare at him. His hands started to shake, but he forced himself to take a deep breath, just like he'd practiced during public speaking sessions at the conference. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice somehow staying calm even as his heart raced. "I bought this ticket through the airline's website. I have the confirmation email on my phone." He reached for his phone, but Karen was already waving over security. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Attempting to board with fraudulent documents is a serious offense. Ethan felt like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare. The security guard approached, hand resting on his belt, while other passengers either stared openly or pretended not to notice what was happening. The little kids who had been playing earlier now hid behind their mother, peering at him like he was some kind of criminal. The worst part wasn't the accusations or even the torn ticket. It was the look in Karen's eyes. She wasn't just doing her job or making an honest mistake. There was something else there, something that made Ethan's stomach turn as he realized why he'd been singled out. It was the same look he'd seen before, though his parents had tried to shield him from it. The look that said he didn't belong here, that he must have done something wrong simply because of who he was. Robert Johnson sat in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, focused on the numbers in front of him. Running an airline meant there was always another crisis, another meeting, another decision to make. But something made him glance at the screen this time. 3 missed calls from Ethan. His son never called multiple times unless it was important. Robert's chest tightened as he reached for the phone. Quarterly reports forgotten. The last time Ethan had called like this was when he'd gotten lost on a school trip 2 years ago. Before he could call back, a text message popped up. "Dad, something happened at the airport. Can you call when you can?" Robert looked at the family photo on his desk. Him, his wife Sarah, and Ethan at the Grand Canyon last summer. They were all smiling, windswept and happy. He'd worked hard to give them a good life, but more importantly, he'd worked hard to stay present in their lives. Unlike his own father, who'd been so caught up in building his business that he'd missed every important moment in Robert's childhood. When he'd started the airline 15 years ago, he'd made a promise to himself. Success wouldn't come at the cost of his family. He kept his ownership quiet, ran things from behind the scenes, and made it home for dinner most nights. His employees knew him as Mr. Johnson, the majority shareholder who rarely appeared in public but somehow always knew what was happening in every corner of the company. But Ethan? Ethan just knew him as Dad. The guy who taught him how to ride a bike, who helped with math homework, who showed up to every school play and basketball game. Robert had never told his son about owning the airline. He wanted Ethan to grow up normal, to learn the value of hard work and humility without the weight of expectations that came with being a CEO's son. Robert dialed Ethan's number, pushing aside the stack of papers on his desk. His son picked up on the first ring, voice shaky but trying to sound strong. As Ethan explained what happened at the gate, Robert's free hand curled into a fist. His airline. His son. His responsibility. He listened quietly, letting Ethan tell the whole story without interruption. That was something Sarah had taught him. Sometimes people just need to be heard. When Ethan finished, Robert took a deep breath before speaking. "Are you okay?" he asked first, because that mattered more than anything else.
"Yeah, I guess."
Just embarrassed. And angry. Ethan's voice cracked a little. "I didn't do anything wrong, Dad." "I know you didn't, son." Robert stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where he'd pushed Ethan on the swing set years ago. "You handled it exactly right." Staying calm, trying to explain. "I'm proud of you." They talked for a few more minutes, Robert giving Ethan the space to process his feelings while gently steering him toward solutions. They'd file a formal complaint. Document everything. Follow the proper channels. That's what Robert always taught him. Face problems head on, but do it the right way. After hanging up, Robert sat back down at his desk and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered his next move. He could solve this problem in seconds. One email would have that flight attendant fired and a formal apology issued before dinner. But that wasn't a lesson he wanted to teach his son. Power without responsibility was dangerous. Change without understanding was temporary. Instead, he began typing a different kind of email. One that would start an investigation into discriminatory practices across the entire airline. One that would lead to real, lasting change. Because being a good father meant more than just protecting your child. It meant building a better world for them to grow up in. The video hit social media that evening. Someone at the gate had recorded everything on their phone. Ethan's polite confusion, Karen's hostile accusation, the torn ticket floating to the ground in pieces. By midnight, it had over 1 million views. Ethan first realized things had blown up when his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from friends, old classmates, even people he'd just met at the leadership conference. Everyone wanted to know if he was okay, if they could help, if he needed anything. His best friend Marcus called around 11. "Man, you're trending," Marcus said, his voice a mix of concern and disbelief. "People are mad. Like, really mad." Ethan sat on his bed, scrolling through the comments. Some made him want to cry. Others made him feel less alone. There were hundreds of stories from people who'd faced similar treatment at airports, in stores, at restaurants. The hashtag Justice for Ethan was picking up steam, along with hashtag Boycott Skyways. His mom knocked on his door around midnight, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside him. Sarah Johnson had always been the one who could read his moods perfectly. "It's weird," Ethan said, taking a sip. "When it happened, I felt so small. Like I was all alone.
But now..."
He gestured at his phone, where notifications were still popping up. "Now you're seeing that you're not alone," Sarah finished. "And that people care." The next morning, local news vans parked outside their house. Ethan watched from his window as reporters set up their cameras on the sidewalk. His phone showed missed calls from 3 different news stations. "You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to," his dad said over breakfast. But Ethan had been thinking about it all night. About all the comments he'd read, all the stories people had shared.
I think I should, he said.
Not for me, but for everyone else who's gone through this. Someone needs to speak up. The interview wasn't as scary as he'd expected. The reporter, a woman named Janet Chen, asked straightforward questions and actually listened to his answers. Ethan spoke from the heart, describing not just what happened, but how it felt. How the worst part wasn't the inconvenience or even the humiliation, it was knowing that this happens to people every day. His old basketball coach called that afternoon. "The team's behind you, Johnson," he said gruffly. "We're organizing a protest at the airport next weekend. Peaceful, by the book. Just letting them know this isn't okay." Word spread through their community like wildfire. The local civil rights organization reached out. Their church group started a letter-writing campaign to the airline's board of directors. Even Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street, who barely spoke English, brought over a huge plate of homemade empanadas and gave Ethan a long hug. The airline's first response came late that night, a generic statement about investigating the incident and taking appropriate action. But people weren't having it. The comment section filled with more stories, more demands for real change. Someone started an online petition that got 50,000 signatures in less than 12 hours. Ethan lay in bed that night, thinking about everything that had happened. The incident itself felt almost distant now, overshadowed by what came after, this incredible wave of support and solidarity. His phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from a kid he'd met at the leadership conference. "Remember what they taught us. Sometimes the worst moments create the best opportunities for change." Robert sat in his private office downtown, away from the corporate headquarters where everyone knew him as the CEO. Here, he could think clearly, away from the constant interruptions and politics of the main office. The video of Ethan's incident played on his computer screen for the 10th time, each viewing stoking a fire in his gut that threatened to consume his usual calm demeanor. His phone lit up with a message from James Chin, the head of PR. "Sir, this statement isn't cutting it. Social media's getting worse. Traditional media picking it up now. CNN wants to run a segment." Robert rubbed his temples. He'd known the generic corporate response wouldn't be enough, but he'd let the PR team try it their way first. Now it was time for real action. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Sandra? It's Robert Johnson." "Yes, that Robert Johnson. I need you to clear my schedule for the next 3 days. And get me Marcus Williams from legal up here." Quietly. He spent the next hour making calls to board members he trusted, people who'd been with the airline since the early days. People who understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant more than protecting the bottom line. Marcus arrived looking concerned. He'd been Robert's friend since law school, one of the few people who knew the full story of how Robert had built the airline from nothing. "How's Ethan?" he asked first, showing why Robert trusted him above the dozen other lawyers on retainer. "Handling it better than I am," Robert admitted, gesturing for Marcus to sit. "But this isn't just about Ethan anymore. You've seen the stories coming out?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Hundreds of them. Similar incidents, different airports, different employees. It's not just one bad apple, Robert. It's systemic," Robert finished. "I know. I've been reading them all night." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "I built this airline to be different, Marcus. Remember our first business plan? Aviation for everyone. What happened? They spent the next few hours outlining a plan. Not just damage control, but real, structural change. Robert insisted on a complete audit of every discrimination complaint filed in the past 5 years. Marcus argued for bringing in outside consultants, experts in corporate culture and bias training. "The board won't like it," Marcus warned. "This kind of overhaul, it's expensive, time-consuming. Some of them will fight you on this." "Let them," Robert said quietly. "I still hold majority shares. And I'd rather rebuild this airline from the ground up than let it stay the way it is." He thought about Ethan at home, dealing with reporters and messages from strangers. His son hadn't asked for any of this. But maybe, just maybe, some good could come from it. Late that night, Robert drafted 2 emails. The first went to the board, calling for an emergency meeting. The second went to Karen Lewis's supervisor, requesting all documentation related to her hiring, training, and past incidents. He hesitated before sending the second one. It would be so easy to just fire her, make her the scapegoat. But that wouldn't solve the real problem. Time to clean house, he muttered, hitting send on both emails. Starting from the top down. His phone buzzed again. Another message from PR about mounting pressure from the media. Robert ignored it. Instead, he opened his personal email and started writing to someone more important. Dear Ethan, I know things are crazy right now, but I want you to know something. Change doesn't always come the way we expect it to, but when it does come, we have to be ready to grab it with both hands. The emergency board meeting started exactly at 8 a.m. in the top floor conference room. Coffee grew cold in paper cups as Robert laid out his plan. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. With all due respect, Robert, Thomas Bradford spoke first, adjusting his tie. This seems like an overreaction. One incident, unfortunate as it was one incident that went viral, interrupted Sarah Chen, the youngest board member. She flipped through the report in front of her. But these numbers tell a different story. Hundreds of complaints in the past year alone. We just got good at burying them. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Half the board members talked about stock prices and shareholder confidence. Others argued about budgets and training costs. Robert let them argue, watching faces, noting who spoke up and who stayed quiet. In her office 3 floors down, Karen Lewis sat staring at her computer screen. Her inbox overflowed with hate mail. Her supervisor had put her on administrative leave pending investigation, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching the video of herself, seeing her actions through other people's eyes. She barely recognized the person she'd become. I was just following protocol, she whispered to her empty office. But even she didn't believe that anymore. The employee handbook sat open on her desk, and nowhere did it say to treat anyone the way she'd treated that boy. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then dialed HR. Maybe it was time to tell them about other incidents she'd witnessed, things she'd stayed quiet about to fit in. Back in the boardroom, Robert finally stood up. The arguments died down as he walked to the window, his back to the room. You know what my first job was? He asked quietly.
Bagagehandler New York.
Minimum wage, graveyard shift. I learned more about running an airline in those 6 months than in 4 years of business school. He turned to face the board. I learned that every person who works for us, from the CEO to the cleanup crew, affects how passengers feel about flying with us.
And right now?
People are afraid to fly with us. Not because of our safety record or our prices, but because they don't trust us to treat them like human beings. The room stayed quiet as Robert clicked through a presentation. Customer satisfaction ratings, dropping steadily over 3 years. Employee turnover rates, higher than industry average. Social media sentiment analysis, showing a growing trend of negative experiences. This isn't just about one viral video, he said. This is about who we are as a company. And right now, we're failing. The changes started small. HR reviewed every complaint filed in the past year, looking for patterns. Department heads had to attend sensitivity training first, before rolling it out to their teams. Employee feedback sessions were scheduled, with anonymous reporting options for those afraid to speak up. Some managers resigned rather than adapt. Others surprised everyone by embracing the changes, sharing their own stories of discrimination they'd witnessed or experienced. Middle management split into 2 camps, those who saw the need for change and those who resisted it at every turn. In the break room, flight attendants and gate agents whispered about Karen. Some defended her, saying she was just doing her job. Others shared stories about times they'd wanted to speak up, but stayed quiet. The company message boards lit up with debates about what good customer service really meant. A month after the incident, Robert sat in his office reviewing the latest reports. The numbers weren't great, complaints were actually up, but for a different reason. People were finally feeling brave enough to report problems. Stock prices had taken a hit, but were stabilizing. 3 board members had resigned, but their replacements brought fresh perspectives and actual experience in corporate diversity initiatives. His phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Dad, you watching the news? They're saying the airline's making big changes. Think it'll work? Robert smiled as he typed back, "Change is messy, son. But it's worth it. Want to grab lunch and talk about it?" Ethan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. The local news had invited him to speak about his experience, and despite all the practice he'd done, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. His phone lit up with a text from Marcus. "You got this, bro.
Just tell
it like it is." 2 months had passed since the airport incident. What started as the worst day of his life had somehow turned into something bigger than himself. His inbox was full of messages from other teenagers sharing their stories, discrimination at school, in stores, at restaurants. Each story made him more determined to speak up. "You ready?" his mom asked, poking her head in. Sarah had been his rock through all of this, helping him practice his speaking points, teaching him how to handle tough questions from reporters. She'd also been the one to suggest he start keeping a journal of everything that happened. "What if I mess up?" Ethan asked, finally giving up on the tie. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Sarah walked over and fixed his tie with practiced hands. "There is no wrong thing when you're speaking your truth. Remember what you told me last week? About why you're doing this?" Ethan nodded. He'd been up late reading emails from other kids, unable to sleep after seeing how many people faced the same treatment every day. Because staying quiet doesn't help anyone. The interview went better than he expected. Instead of focusing on the incident, Ethan talked about what came after, the community support, the hundreds of messages, the need for change. The host seemed surprised by his composure, especially when she asked if he was angry about what happened. "Sure, I was angry at first," Ethan said, remembering the practice sessions with his mom. "But being angry doesn't fix anything. What fixes things is speaking up, working together, making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." After the interview, his phone blew up with messages. But one stood out, an email from a civil rights organization asking if he'd speak at their youth leadership summit. The same summit he'd been too nervous to apply for last year. That night at dinner, his dad seemed different, prouder somehow. "You know," Robert said, passing the salad bowl, "when I was your age, I would have been too scared to do what you're doing." Ethan shrugged, but inside he felt warm at the praise. "I'm still scared. Every time I talk about it, every time I read another story someone sends me. But maybe being brave isn't about not being scared. Maybe it's about doing what's right anyway." The summit invitation led to more speaking requests. Ethan started a blog, sharing not just his story, but others' stories too. With his friends' help, he organized a student group at school focused on addressing discrimination in their community. They called it Speak Up, Stand Up, and within a month, 5 other schools had started their own chapters. Sometimes late at night, Ethan would think back to that day at the airport. He remembered how small and helpless he'd felt. Now, looking at the growing movement he'd somehow helped start, he felt something different. Not pride exactly, but purpose. Every message from someone who'd faced similar treatment, every story shared at their group meetings, every small victory in pushing for change, it all added up to something bigger than himself. His journal entry that night was simple. "Maybe sometimes the worst things that happen to us give us the chance to make things better for everyone else. And maybe that's how change really happens, not all at once but one voice at a time, until there are too many voices to ignore." Change came to Skyways Airlines one department at a time. It started in the training center, where new flight attendants and gate agents gathered for their first day of orientation. Instead of the usual corporate videos about safety procedures and customer service scripts, they found themselves in a room with Michael Chin, the new head of employee development. "Look around this room," Michael said, standing in front of the diverse group. "Each of you brings something unique to this airline. Your experiences, your perspectives, your understanding of different cultures and communities. That's not a liability, it's our greatest asset." The new training program didn't just focus on what employees should do, it helped them understand why. Role-playing exercises put them in passengers' shoes. Guest speakers shared personal stories of discrimination. Every procedure was reviewed and rewritten with input from staff at all levels. In the terminals, subtle changes appeared. Signs in multiple languages. Prayer rooms and quiet spaces. Family-friendly areas. But the biggest changes weren't visible. They were in the attitudes of the staff themselves. Karen Lewis, surprisingly, became one of the program's strongest advocates. After her suspension, she'd done something unexpected. She'd asked to be part of the solution. Now she stood in front of training groups, sharing her story. "I thought I was just following rules," she told them. "But rules without compassion, without understanding, they're just another way to build walls between people. We're here to help people travel, to connect with their loved ones, to explore the world. How can we do that if we're letting our biases get in the way?" The changes weren't always smooth. Some employees resigned, claiming the new policies were too restrictive. Others struggled to adapt to the increased scrutiny of their decisions. But for every person who resisted, there were two more who embraced the new direction. Robert watched it all from his office, reading daily reports and employee feedback. The numbers were starting to tell a new story. Customer complaints down 30%. Employee satisfaction scores rising. Social media sentiment shifting from angry hashtags to positive reviews. The turning point came 3 months after Ethan's incident. A passenger at Chicago O'Hare had a problem with his ticket, similar to what had happened with Ethan. But this time, the gate agent handled it differently. She listened, checked the system thoroughly, found the error was on their end, and fixed it. The passenger was so impressed, he wrote a viral post about it. "That's how it should work," Robert told his board members, sharing the story. "Not because we're afraid of bad publicity, but because it's the right thing to do." The airline started working with civil rights organizations, hosting community forums, seeking input from diverse groups. They hired consultants who specialized in corporate culture change, but more importantly, they listened to their own employees. A year after the incident, Skyways introduced a new marketing campaign. "Everyone's journey matters." But it wasn't just a slogan. It was backed by concrete policies, regular training updates, and a clear system for reporting and addressing discrimination. The task force that had started as an emergency response became a permanent part of the company's structure. They met weekly, reviewing incidents, updating procedures, and ensuring the reforms didn't lose momentum. Sometimes they invited Ethan to sit in on meetings, valuing his perspective as both a catalyst for change and a representative of the younger generation they needed to reach. "You know what the best part is?" Robert asked during one of his regular lunches with Marcus. "It's not just about avoiding another incident. The whole company feels different. People actually want to work here again." Marcus nodded, looking at the latest employee survey results. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what needs to change. The trick is being brave enough to actually make those changes." 2 years after the incident, Ethan stood at the same gate where it had all started. This time, he wasn't a passenger. He was here to speak at Skyway's annual employee conference. The terminal looked different now, brighter somehow, with new signs welcoming travelers in multiple languages and helpful staff wearing "Ask Me for Help" badges. "Remember this spot?" his dad asked, standing beside him. They'd arrived early, watching the morning rush of travelers moving smoothly through security and check-in. "Hard to forget," Ethan replied, but there was no bitterness in his voice anymore. At 19, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from turning pain into purpose. The Justice Collective, which had started as a small student group, now had chapters in 50 high schools across the country. A young gate agent approached them, smiling. "Mr. Johnson, we're ready for you in the conference room." She paused, then added, "I just wanted to say, I did my training with Ms. Lewis. Your story changed her life. Changed all of us, really." As they walked to the conference room, Ethan thought about Karen. She'd retired from gate duty last year, but stayed on as a training consultant. Her sessions on recognizing and addressing bias had become mandatory for all airline staff, not just at Skyways, but at several other airlines that had adopted similar programs. The conference room was packed with airline employees from all departments. Robert sat in the back, watching proudly as Ethan took the stage. His son hadn't just survived that terrible day, he'd used it to spark real change. Ethan looked at his notes, then set them aside. 2 years ago, I stood at gate B7 feeling alone and powerless, he began. Today, I'm standing here because none of us is really alone, and we're only powerless if we choose to be silent. He shared stories from the Justice Collective, students standing up against discrimination in their schools, communities coming together to demand better treatment, companies reaching out for guidance on creating more inclusive environments. Skyways had become a case study in corporate transformation, featured in business schools and industry publications. After the speech, Robert and Ethan walked through the terminal together. They passed the wall of employee photos, now featuring faces of all ages and backgrounds. Near the main entrance, a new plaque caught Ethan's eye. "Everyone's journey matters. Our commitment to equal treatment and respect for all." "You know what's funny?" Ethan said as they headed to the parking lot. "That day, all I wanted was to get home. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Robert smiled, thinking about how close he'd come to simply firing Karen and sweeping the whole incident under the rug. Sometimes the hardest moments show us what needs to change, and sometimes the youngest voices speak the loudest truths. The Justice Collective continued to grow, spreading from schools to workplaces. Other companies started reaching out, asking for help in reviewing their policies and training their staff. Skyway's employee handbook became a model for the industry, and their training programs were adopted by transportation companies across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest, the way people treated each other at airports, not just at Skyways, but everywhere. Small kindnesses, moments of understanding, the recognition that behind every ticket and every transaction was a human being with their own story. That evening, Ethan updated his blog one last time. Change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it starts with one person, one moment, one decision to speak up. And once that first voice breaks the silence, others find their courage too. That's how we build a better world. One story, one change, one journey at a time.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.